A single American plane, a single bomb, and in one blinding second, an entire Japanese city simply ceased to exist. Hours later, a Japanese officer flies over the city to confirm what his commanders refused to believe. Below him, there is no city left. Only a burning scar where 250,000 people had woken that morning. He was sent to check a rumor. He became one of the first men sent from Tokyo to look down on the weapon that would end the Second World War. The truth reached Tokyo that same day, yet the most powerful men in Japan would spend 8 more days refusing to say it out loud. 8 days, 2 atomic bombs, a Soviet invasion, and a coup at midnight to keep the emperor's own voice off the air. This is the story of those 8 days. At 16 minutes past 8 in the morning, a man in Tokyo notices that a city has stopped speaking. He is an operator at the Japan Broadcasting Corporation. His job is simple: keep the signal alive, move the program from one line to the next when a line fails. And a moment ago, without warning, the station in Hiroshima went silent. Not static, not the crackle of interference, silence. He tries another line, nothing. He reaches for a third, nothing again. Somewhere to the southwest, a voice that was there a heartbeat ago is simply gone. So he does what any trained man does. He notes the time, he logs the fault, he assumes it is a problem he can fix. And he moves on, because outages like this have become ordinary in the 6th year of a losing war. It is not a problem he can fix. 20 minutes later, the Railway Telegraph Center in Tokyo feels the same wound from a different angle. The main line, the steel nervous system that carries orders and troops and news across the country, has gone dead just north of Hiroshima. The current runs partway down the coast, and then it reaches nothing at all. Then the first human voices arrive. From small railway stops within 10 miles of the city, fragments come in, a terrible flash, a single enormous explosion, and then no way to reach Hiroshima at all. The reports are confused, they contradict each other. They are passed up the chain until they land where all such things land, on the desks of the Army General Staff. You must understand what Hiroshima was to understand why the silence frightened them. This was not an ordinary city. Hiroshima was the headquarters of the 2nd General Army, commanded by Field Marshal Shunroku Hata, 66 years old, a soldier of the old school. It held one of the largest military depots in western Japan. Tens of thousands of troops moved through it. Its port loaded men and supplies for the war in the south. If any city in the country should have been able to answer a telephone that morning, it was this one, and it answered nothing. What the men in Tokyo could not know was that the answer had already been given 6 hours earlier and 1,500 miles away on a small island in the Pacific called Tinian. There, at 2:45 in the morning, a heavy American bomber had lifted off a runway into the dark. It was a B-29 Superfortress, the largest bomber in the world, and this one carried a name painted fresh on its nose: Enola Gay. In the pilot's seat sat a colonel named Paul Tibbets, 30 years old, a careful and gifted fleer who had trained his crew for months without ever telling most of them what they truly carried. In the belly of the plane sat a single bomb. They had nicknamed it Little Boy. It was a long steel tube, and inside it waited a small amount of uranium and a mechanism to slam 2 pieces of that uranium together at enormous speed. No weapon like it had ever been used against a human city. The men aboard knew it would be powerful. Even the scientists were not entirely certain how powerful. The flight was smooth. The weather over the target was clear. At just past 8 in the morning, local time, the bomb doors opened over the center of Hiroshima, and Little Oi fell away toward the waking city below. It did not strike the ground. It was never meant to. At roughly 1,900 feet above the streets, in the empty air over a hospital near it detonated. In that instant, the temperature at the center of the blast climbed to something hotter than the surface of the sun. A flash of light crossed the sky with no sound at all, because it moved faster than sound could follow. Then came the heat, and then the pressure, rolling outward in a wall that flattened almost everything for 2 kilometers in every direction. Wood, stone, steel, and flesh. In a single second, the heart of a city holding 250,000 people or more was gone. This is what had answered the telephone with silence. Back in Tokyo, the officers at headquarters did not know any of it. They knew only that a great city had fallen quiet and that the reports made no sense, so they try again. They call the Army control station in Hiroshima directly, They wait, they call again. But the complete silence puzzles them because they know what they have not seen. They know no large formation of enemy bombers crossed the coast that morning. They know there was no great store of explosives inside the city waiting to go up. Nothing in their experience explains how an entire military city could fall silent from a single strike. So they reach for the explanation that costs them nothing. A raid, a large one perhaps. Communications knocked out, as they have been knocked out in dozens of cities before. Unfortunate but familiar, the kind of thing you wait out. But the survivor reports keep coming and they refuse to behave. Because the people stumbling toward the outskirts are not describing a raid. They speak of one aircraft, perhaps two, not a wave of bombers, not an hour of falling bombs, a single blinding flash in a clear sky, and then a wall of force, and then nothing left standing. The staff officers turn this over and cannot make it fit. An incendiary cluster does not do this. A fuel explosion does not do this. Even the largest conventional bomb they can imagine does not erase a city with one flash. The scale solving has no name in any manual they have ever read. By the middle of the morning, they stop guessing. A young officer of the general staff is ordered to fly to Hiroshima himself, to land, to see with his own eyes, to bring back something reliable because everything on the desk so far is rumor and smoke. The mood at headquarters as he leaves is almost dismissive. Surely nothing so terrible has really happened. Surely this is a rumor grown large from a few small sparks of truth. He boards his aircraft, he turns southwest, and he flies toward a city that in every way that matters is no longer there. While he is in the air, on the ground beneath him, the truth is being written in bodies. There was a doctor in Hiroshima that morning named Michishiko Hachiya. He was the director of the communications hospital, and he lived beside it about a mile from the point over which the bomb burst. He had just come off a long night shift and was resting at home when the light came. He would later say he saw a brilliant flash, and then his home came apart around him. When he staggered upright, he was nearly naked, his clothes torn away, his body pierced with glass and splinters of wood. Blood ran from a wound at his neck. His wife found him. Together they stumbled out into what had been their neighborhood, and there the ordinary world ended. The streets were full of people who no longer looked like people. Their skin hung from them in ribbons. Some held their arms out from their bodies because let them touch their sides was agony. They did not scream. That was the thing the survivors remembered most. They moved in a terrible silence, walking away from the center of the city in a slow, endless line, and many of them were already dying as they walked. At the hospital, the doctor tried to work, though he could barely stand. The wounded came in numbers that no hospital on earth could hold. There was no clean water. There were not enough hands, and among the injured were people with no visible wounds at all, people who had survived the blast and the fire, who now grew sick in a way no one understood. They vomited, their hair fell out in handfuls. Small spots appeared beneath their skin, and then, days later, many of them died too. The doctor did not have a word for what he was seeing because the word did not yet exist in his country. He was watching radiation sickness fill his wards, and he did not know its name. This was the city the young officer from Tokyo was flying toward. For 3 hours there is only the drone of the engine and the coastline sliding past. He is still 100 miles out when he sees it. Not the city, the smoke. A single column standing straight up off the earth, tens of thousands of feet high, wide at its base, still climbing into the afternoon. He flies closer, and then his training abandons him because there is nothing to assess. Below him, the center of Hiroshima is gone. Not damaged, not burning in patches. Gone. A flat gray scar where dense streets full of people stood at breakfast. He circles once. He circles again because the mind reaches for a second look when the first one cannot be believed. The fires still burn along the outer rings. He does what he can from the air, and then he turns for the nearest field that still exists. His report reaches Tokyo by evening, and here is the thing they did not want to know, arriving now in a form they can no longer refuse. This was never a communications outage. This was not a raid to be waited out. One aircraft carrying one weapon had wiped the heart of a headquarters city of 250,000 people off the map in a single flash. 70,000, and likely far more, were already dead. The silence on the telephone line had a meaning after all. The meaning was total. That is what the General Staff learned on the 6th of August. What they still did not know was what had done it. That answer did not come from their own officer, circling in disbelief. It did not come from Field Marshal Hata, who was in Hiroshima and survived with minor injuries despite the destruction of the 2nd General Army headquarters near Hiroshima Castle. It did not come from any Japanese source at all. It came from the enemy. 16 hours after the blast, a voice from Washington speaks to the entire world. President Harry Truman, 61 years old, does not reach for careful language. He names the weapon plainly, an atomic bomb. The force, he says, of more than 20,000 tons of TNT packed into a single device dropped from a single plane. And then a warning aimed straight at the men in Tokyo who will soon be reading the transcript. If Japan's leaders do not accept the terms of surrender, they can expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Japanese monitoring stations catch the broadcast almost as it happens. Translators work through the night. Within hours, the transcript is on the desks of the Army General Staff and the Foreign Ministry, and a gap opens that will not close. On the afternoon of August 7, Japan's Imperial General Headquarters issued its first official announcement, acknowledging considerable damage in Hiroshima and referring to a new type of bomb. It admits an attack on Hiroshima. It admits considerable damage, and it describes the weapon with 3 careful words: a new type of bomb. Not atomic, not the end of an age of warfare. A new type of bomb. Every word technically true, every word deliberately, carefully insufficient. So consider where the truth now sits. The Japanese High Command has been told by its own eyes that a city is gone. It has been told by its enemy exactly what killed it. The victim has learned the true nature of its wound from the man who inflicted it, and then it turned to its own people and said almost nothing. By the end of August 6, Tokyo had received rich reports of Hiroshima's devastation and Truman's announcement that an atomic bomb had been used. But Japanese verification continued over the next 2 days, and uncertainty remained about the weapon and the American stockpile. What happened next was not a struggle to discover the truth. The truth was already in the room. What happened next was a struggle over whether anyone in power was willing to say it out loud. And that struggle would cost another city, and very nearly the government itself. In Tokyo, one man refuses to let the word be spoken. His name is Korichika Anami. He is 58 years old, the Minister of War, and he carries himself like a soldier who has never once considered that the war could simply end. His face is calm, his voice is steady, and inside the government, his voice is the loudest voice in every room. Anami has read the Truman transcript. He does not pretend nothing happened. A city is gone, and he knows it. But his mind does not run toward grief or toward science. It runs to a single hard question. If the army admits that one bomb from one plane destroyed Hiroshima, then how does any general still stand up and ask boys to die defending the coast? The answer frightens him more than the bomb does, and so he reaches for the one thing that can buy him time: doubt. He demands proof, real proof, not a frightened cable from a young officer circling in the smoke, not a broadcast from an enemy president who has every reason to exaggerate. He wants Japanese scientists to stand on that ground and tell him with certainty what fell out of the sky. And so the government sends the one man in Japan most qualified to give the answer and least able to bear giving it. His name is Yoshio Nishina. He is 54 years old. He is the father of modern physics in Japan, a friend of the great minds of Europe, a man who has spent his life inside the atom. And there is something the War Ministry would rather not dwell on. For years, Nishina had led the Army's own effort to build an atomic bomb. He knows this weapon from the inside. He knows it because he chased it himself and could not reach it. His own project had a name. It was called Naigo. It had struggled for materials, for money, for the rare uranium it needed in a country already bleeding its resources into a losing war. In the end, Nishina's team concluded that an atomic bomb was theoretically possible, but beyond Japan's wartime technical and industrial capacity. There is no solid basis for saying. He assured the government that the United States was still years away from building one. Now he boards a plane on the 8th of August, alongside a team of scientists and army doctors led by Lieutenant General Seizo Arasue, and he flies toward Hiroshima to confirm what, in his heart, he already feared. He does not need to land to know. From the air, he looks down on the scorched plain where a city used to breathe, and the certainty settles over him like a cold weight. This is the thing he once tried to build. This is the thing he told his own leaders even America would struggle to make. He was wrong, and the proof of how wrong he was is burning beneath his window, filled with his countrymen. On the ground, the science is merciless and quiet, the pattern of the burns. The strange sickness in people who have no visible wound, the same sickness filling Dr. Hachiya's wards a mile from the center. The reach of the destruction from a single point in the sky. Every measurement says the same thing. Every measurement says atomic. On the 8th of August, Nishina wires his confirmation back to Tokyo. There is no longer any uncertainty. The weapon that erased Hiroshima was a nuclear bomb, exactly as the enemy said. The truth is now complete, and here is what you must sit with, because it is the dark heart of this entire story. It changes nothing. Anami receives the confirmation he demanded, the confirmation from his own trusted scientists, and in the meetings that follow, his argument is the same as it was before Nishina ever left Tokyo. One weapon, he says, however terrible, does not change the fundamental equation. Japan still holds its home islands. The American invasion, when it comes, will land on beaches, defended the last man. It will cost the enemy hundreds of thousands of lives, and that price, that terrible price, is the only card Japan has left to play. To surrender now because of a single bomb is to throw that card away before it is ever tested. Understand what is happening here, because it is the thing most people get wrong about this story. This is not a failure to understand. By the 8th of August, the men in that room understood everything. They knew Hiroshima had been destroyed by an atomic bomb, but they did not know how many such weapons the United States possessed, or when another could be used. What failed was not the mind. What failed was the willingness to let the knowledge become a decision. Across the table sits the man who cannot bear that silence any longer. Shigenori Togo, 62 years old, the foreign minister, has read the same transcript and looked at the same confirmation and reached the opposite conclusion. To him, Truman's broadcast was not a threat to be endured. It was an inventory. The enemy was not bluffing about having more. The enemy was announcing it. Togo argues that everything has changed, that the Potsdam Declaration, the surrender terms Japan publicly threw away just 2 weeks earlier, must be picked up off the floor and read again. Those terms still offer something. Surrender, yes. Occupation, yes. But the survival of the Japanese state itself. And that, Togo says, is more than Japan will have left if the bombs keep falling. Two old men, the same facts, the same burning city in the same reports, and a chasm between them that no argument can close, because the disagreement is not about what is true. It is about what a man is willing to do once he admits the truth. The Prime Minister, Kantaro Suzuki, 77 years old, sits between them and does not force the room to choose. He is a survivor of a lifetime of Japanese politics. He is also a survivor in the most literal sense. An old admiral who had been shot several times in an attempted coup years before and who carried the bullets in his body still. He knows how quickly the wrong word can get a man killed by his own side, so the cabinet talks. And then the cabinet adjourns. No decision. The deadlock holds exactly as it has held for months. And then, in the space of a single day, the ground shifts 3 times and every excuse Anami has built begins to fall. The first blow comes in the dark. On the night of the 8th of August, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan. For years, Tokyo had quietly hoped Moscow, still neutral in the Pacific, might serve as a go-between to negotiate a softer peace. That hope dies in one sentence. Before dawn on the 9th, Soviet armies pour across the border into Manchuria, and they crash into the Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japan, now hollowed out to feed other fronts. The line buckles almost at once. The northern shield Anami had counted on is breaking as the sun comes up. And then, at 2 minutes past 11 that same morning, the sky opens again. A second American bomber called Boxcar had set out for a city named Kokura. Clouds and smoke covered it, and after 3 passes, the crew could not find their aiming point. So they turned to their second choice. A port city on the western coast, Nagasaki. The bomb that fell on Nagasaki was not the same as the first. This one used plutonium and a different design, a sphere squeezed inward by a ring of explosives until it ignited. In raw force, it was even greater than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, but it burst over a valley in the north of the city, and the hills around that valley walled in the blast and spared other districts, so that as terrible as the toll was, it did not reach the scale of the first. By the end of the year, the dead there would still number in the tens of thousands. Tokyo did not know at the exact moment of detonation. The Supreme War Council had already convened on August 9 because of Hiroshima and the Soviet entry into the war, and news of the Nagasaki bombing reached the leadership during its deliberations. A second city, a second flash, tens of thousands more gone. The argument that Hiroshima was a single anomaly, a one-time horror that could be endured and set aside, dies in the ashes of Nagasaki. 2 bombs in 3 days, a Soviet invasion in the north, and somewhere across the Pacific, an American army still gathering for the landing everyone knows is coming. The military situation has collapsed faster than the Army's careful language was ever willing to admit. That same day, the 9th of August, the inner circle of the government finally meets to face it. This is the Supreme Council for the direction of the war, 6 men who hold the true power over Japan's fate. The Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Minister of War, the Navy Minister, and the 2 chiefs of the Army and Navy staffs. History would come to call them the Big Six, and when they at last sit down to decide whether to accept surrender, they discover that even now, even here, they cannot agree. Everyone in the room accepts that terms must be discussed, but the shape of those terms splits them cleanly in 2. Togo, speaking for peace, argues for a single condition: accept the Allied declaration and ask only one thing in return: that the emperor and his throne be preserved. One condition and no more, because every extra demand is an excuse for the enemy to say no, and every day of delay is another city. But Anami will not agree to one condition. He demands 4. Preserve the emperor, yes, but also this: that Japan not be occupied by foreign troops, or barely at all. That Japan be allowed to disarm its own soldiers by its own hand, and that Japan be allowed to try its own war criminals in its own courts rather than hand its officers to the enemy. Look closely at those 4 demands, because they are not really about surrender. They are the terms of a nation that still believes it holds cards to play. And they are utterly unacceptable to an enemy that has just proven it can erase a city between breakfast and lunch. 3 of the 6 lean toward Togo's single condition. 3, led by Anami, stand behind the 4. And a council that requires agreement to act can produce only one thing from a split like that: nothing. Even now, Anami does not bend. With 1 city gone and a second still burning and an enemy pouring over the northern border, he stands and argues still for the terms that keep the war alive. He is not a stupid man. He is not a man who fails to see. He is a man who has decided that seeing is not the same as surrendering, and he will hold that line until it kills him. But the men who want the war to end have finally seen something too. They have seen that this council, built to require agreement, will never agree. It is a machine engineered to produce paralysis, and it is working perfectly. So the peace faction turns toward the one door in the entire structure that the army cannot slam shut. A door that leads to a quiet man who has said almost nothing through all of this, and whose single word, once spoken, no general in Japan is permitted to overrule. They decide to go to the emperor. There is one man who has been watching the government fail quietly since the morning Hiroshima went silent. His name is Koichi Kido. He is 56 years old, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, which means he is the man closest to the emperor, the last filter between the throne and the storm. He has read every cable. He has watched the council meet and argue and adjourn with nothing decided. He has seen 2 cities die while old men fought over a word. And Kido understands something the others have been too afraid to say. This deadlock will never break itself. 3 for peace. 3 for war. The machine will grind forever, and while it grinds, the bombs will keep falling. So he reaches for the one lever no soldier can block. He goes to the emperor and to the prime minister, and together they arrange something almost with precedent: an imperial conference. A direct session in the presence of the emperor himself, called to break a deadlock the cabinet cannot break on its own. Because there is a truth buried deep in the structure of Japan that even Anami cannot argue with. When the emperor speaks, the argument is over. They gather just before midnight as the 9th of August turns into the 10th in an underground shelter beneath the imperial palace. The air is close and hot and thick. The men who have circled each other for days now stand in the same small room, and above them, the country is losing a war by the hour. Anami speaks. Even here, even now, he argues for the war to continue. His voice does not shake. He believes what he says, and that is what makes him so hard to move. Togo speaks. He asks them to accept the terms and end it before there is nothing left of Japan to save. The room cannot resolve itself. Of course it cannot. It never has. And then Prime Minister Suzuki, old and weary, rises and does the thing no one expected. He turns to the throne, and he asks the emperor himself to decide. Every eye turns to the one figure who has sat in silence through all of it. Emperor Hirohito is 44 years old. For his entire reign, he has been a presence, not a voice. A man who reigns above the fray and does not descend into it. Emperors do not break deadlocks. Emperors do not choose sides in front of their ministers. Tonight he does. He speaks quietly, and what he says lands like a weight in that airless room. He tells them he can no longer bear to watch his people suffer. He tells them the time has come to endure the unendurable. He accepts the Allied terms on the single condition that his throne endure. The war, he is saying, must end. Listen closely, even in this moment, and you'll hear the ghost of the same careful silence that has haunted this story from the first day. Because the emperor does not say the word surrender. Not even now, not even here. He speaks of enduring what cannot be endured. He speaks of a bitter duty. But the plainest word, the true word, still cannot be spoken aloud, even by the one man in Japan whose voice no one is allowed to question. The decision is made, but the story is not over because the decision on paper is not yet a decision in the world. Anami leaves that shelter a defeated man. He had argued to the last, and the last had come. And somewhere in him, in the days that follow, he begins quietly to prepare an ending of his own. For 5 more days, the machinery of surrender grinds forward, and it is slow and it is dangerous. Japan transmits its acceptance to the Allies through neutral countries, through Switzerland, and through Sweden, carrying its single condition that the emperor keep his throne. The world waits. And then the Allied reply comes back, written for the American government by a man named James Burns, the Secretary of State. The answer is careful. The Allied reply did not guarantee that the emperor would remain. It stated that his authority and that the Japanese government would be subject to the supreme commander, while Japan's ultimate form of government would be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. To the peace faction, this is enough. It is not the clean survival the military had prayed for, but it is a way for the nation to go on living. To the hardliners, it is a trap and an insult and proof that surrender means the end of everything they swore to protect. And so the argument that was supposed to be over begins again, in the same rooms, with the same men on the very edge of the end. And still, even now, the war tries to refuse to die, because not every soldier will accept what the emperor has decided. Within the army are young officers who would rather see the country burn to the ground than kneel. To them, surrender is not tragedy. It is betrayal, and they decide to stop it with their own hands. On the night of the 14th of August, they move. At their center is a major named Kenji Hatanaka, 33 years old, a man consumed by the conviction that he is saving the soul of Japan. His plan is desperate and specific. The emperor has recorded his surrender message, his actual voice, spoken onto a phonograph disc, ready to be broadcast to the entire nation at noon the next day. Hatanaka means to seize that recording before the world can hear it, silence the emperor's own voice, keep the war alive by force. But to control the palace, the rebels need the soldiers who guard it, the Imperial Guards Division, and the commander of that division, Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, will not join them. He will not raise his hand against the emperor's will. So in the dark hours of that night, Hatanaka goes to Mori's office to persuade him. And when the general refuses again, the major draws his weapon and kills him where he stands. With the commander dead, the rebels forge orders in his name, using the authority of a man they have just murdered. They seize the palace grounds. They cut the telephone lines. They pour through the buildings in the dark, searching room by room for a small disc that carries the voice of a living God telling his people the war is lost. Loyal officials hide the recording, moving it, tucking it away among ordinary papers in a locked room. And through the night, soldiers hunt for it and cannot find it. The The recording stays hidden, and by morning, the coup begins to come apart. The senior generals of the region, called to join it, refuse. The army itself, faced with the choice between its emperor and a handful of majors, chooses its emperor. Without support, without the recording, without the palace, the rebellion then collapses in the growing light. And Hatanaka, his last desperate act spent, walks out to the open plaza before the palace and takes his own life, still believing to the end that surrender was the greater crime. He is not the only one who chooses death over the dawn. In the quiet hours before the broadcast, Korichika Anami, the Minister of War, the man whose voice held the whole country in deadlock, kneels and takes his own life in the ancient way of his tradition. He leaves a note. In it, he apologizes to the emperor and asks forgiveness for his failings. But listen to what he does not do, even at the very end. He does not take back a single word he said about the war. He does not admit the army's judgment was wrong. He dies as he lived, holding his line to the last, and he never hears the broadcast that his death could not stop. At noon on the 15th of August, 1945, the impossible happens. For the first time in their lives, almost none of them having ever heard it before, the ordinary people of Japan hear the voice of their emperor come through the radio. Farmers stop in their fields. Families gather close around the set. Soldiers stand at attention before a speaker box, and the voice they have never once heard fills the silence at last. The recording is faint, and the words are old and formal, and many who listen can barely follow them. Even here, in the final message, the language is draped in ceremony. He speaks of a new and most cruel bomb. He speaks of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable. Not once does the word surrender leave his lips. But by the end, everyone kneeling by every radio understands what they have heard. The war is over and hostilities followed the broadcast, but the killing did not stop everywhere at once, and combat deaths continued for several days in isolated air actions and on the Soviet-Japanese fronts. By the end of that year, the dead of Hiroshima would number somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000, and the range so wide, because many sank slowly in the weeks and months after, from burns and from the invisible sickness that doctors could not treat. Nagasaki would count its own dead in the tens of thousands. These are not clean numbers. The people who could have counted were themselves among the counted. The men who spent those 8 days managing the truth lived out endings of their own. Shigenori Togo, the foreign minister who begged them to say the word, was later tried as a war criminal for his part in the earlier years of the war. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and he died there in 1950, before his sentence was through. Koichi Kido, the quiet man who opened the door to the emperor, was sentenced to life and was released, an old man, in 1955. Field Marshal Hata, who survived the blast at the city's edge, was sentenced to life as well and paroled in his final years. The plane that began it all, the Enola Gay, still exists. It sits today in a museum outside Washington, its aluminum body polished and whole, a quiet machine behind a rope, visited by families who were not yet born when it flew. And in Hiroshima, near the point where the bomb burst, one skeleton of a building was left standing amid the flatness, its dome stripped to bare ribs of steel. The city chose not to tear it down. It stands there still, and the world now calls it the atomic bomb, and it has been named a place to be protected for all time, so that no one is ever allowed to forget. Now stand back from all of it and see what these 8 days truly were. The information arrived on the very first day. The city was gone by breakfast, and by evening the men in Tokyo knew it. The enemy named the weapon within 16 hours. Their own greatest scientist confirmed it within 2 days. At no point in this story did the truth hide. At no point did the facts fail to reach the men in power. What failed was something harder to see and harder to forgive: the willingness to let what was known become what was said. The courage to turn understanding into a decision before the delay was paid for in cities. The men in that room were not fools. They were not blind. They understood exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. And still they spent 8 days managing the language of it, while Hiroshima and Nagasaki paid the price of every hour they waited. That is the true weight of this story. Not that the truth was hard to find, but that even when the truth was total, even when it was written in the ashes of 2 cities, the hardest thing in the world was still to say it out loud.